Hello, I'm Dr. Stella Livadi. I'm the assistant professor and the program coordinator of the sports management program at DIRI, the American College of Greece. And I'm welcoming in our next subject, the sports industry Gen Z problem, Mr. Marshall Glickman, CEO of G2 Strategic Global Sports Business Solutions. Hello, I think it's pretty early over there.
Yes, it's just about 7 in the morning. That's not early for me.
Okay, thank you very much for being that early with us.
My pleasure.
So I would like you to tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm sure you have immense experience that is of use to our audience and especially our students, and also about your organization. I really searched for you this morning, and I have my notes, but it's better if you tell us a little bit about yourself and the company.
Well, I'll try to do it in a very brief way. I grew up in this business. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, which is most famous as the home of Nike and the American headquarters of Adidas. I was president of the Portland Trailblazers in a different life through the mid-90s. In that role, I also oversaw the development of a new 20,000 seat arena, which is called the Moda Center. After that, I started another company that redeveloped a stadium, which was home to a AAA, meaning like a second division baseball team, together with a second division soccer team. Today, that soccer team is in Major League Soccer called the Portland Timbers, highly successful team. And we renovated the stadium in partnership with the city of Portland. After that, I received a phone call from EuroLeague basketball, and that led to my family and I relocating to Barcelona for a couple of years. And from that, I launched my company, G2 Strategic. EuroLeague basketball has been a client of ours for something like 20 years now. We also currently work with La Liga, the Spanish Football League, for the last 5 years. And we're also working on a potential new indoor arena for FC Barcelona. In the past, we've had lots of clients. We've kind of built a business around Europe. The Ligue 1 in France has been a client, the ATP, several tennis tournaments, and several other properties. So our company's called G2 Strategic. We're a small boutique consulting firm, and I'm really pleased to be with you. I'm a big lover of Athens. I've been there many times. And so thank you for having me.
Consider your company small.
Very small. We like small.
Okay, because you have such big clients and so many areas. Let me consult my notes. There are areas that have to do with venue management, with venue operations, with event management, with negotiations. I guess you have individual athletes that you negotiate their contract.
No. That's the one thing I don't do. I don't go near sports, and I don't go near athletes. I strictly focus on driving revenues, driving growth, driving relevance, driving brand.
Okay, that's pretty good. And, overall business planning. So, in my eyes, this is big. It's not very small.
Well, we're a small company. What we do is when we move, depending on the nature of the client and the nature of the scope that they're looking for, we tend to bring partners into the picture as needed. So it's worked out, really successfully for us. So we like being small and nimble.
Okay, I know we're talking about Generation Z, but I wanted to ask you, I'm intrigued to ask you, what are the differences in doing business in the United States and in Europe?
Well, there's, we'd need hours, doctor, but I think the main difference is that in the United States, professional sports in particular, and frankly, even amateur sports, has evolved into a business. It's a bottom line business. And, you know, that's controversial with some people because it means that we are, our primary objective of most leagues, of most clubs, of most properties is driving ever increasing profits, growth. Whereas in Europe, sports is more of a cultural imperative. There's a lot more involvement by government. There are many, as you know, big institutions. So there's many stakeholders. Many of those stakeholders have conflicting interests. The governance of sports in most European theaters is quite cumbersome. Not always a bad thing, but it's very different because profit is not necessarily the number one motivator.
Okay, so I will allow you to do your presentation. I know you have one ready, and before you do that, let me express the apologies on behalf of Dr. Nikos Kartakoulis that couldn't be here because of a health problem, and that's why I'm stepping on his shoes.
Well, I'm happy to have you, and I hope the doctor gets healthy and better. So
Okay.
Thank you very much.
We're ready to watch your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you, my old friend Themos, by the way, who made this, gave me this opportunity to speak with you today. I wish I was in Athens in person. So I wanted to talk about a topic that is really something that I have been very focused on with our clients, especially with La Liga and EuroLeague basketball over the last several years. And I've been calling it out, which is, does sports have a Gen Z problem, or is it really a Gen Z opportunity? And what I mean by that is, the understanding that attracting the next generation of audiences is really a matter of survival. And I've been barking about this for many years. I've been trying to put urgency on it. Sometimes I'm listened to and sometimes I'm not. Global sports properties like World Wrestling Entertainment, UFC, obviously they get this. The sports leagues and clubs and properties in the United States and UK tend to get this. European football and other European institutions tend to be far behind, albeit that they're starting to catch up. Overall, the sports industry is far behind entertainment and consumer brands in its recognition of the massive shift in consumer behavior. And in my opinion, we must adapt urgently. And I'll try to explain briefly today why. The notion of parents passing along their love of sports, and particularly teams, to their sons and daughters is no longer a reality. The next generation are digital natives. The phone to them is like a binky. They grow up with it almost in their crib. There is a decline of active participation in youth sports, at least in the States. Gen Zs, younger adults, tend to be a distracted generation. The focus is much more on athletes and stars than it is teams and leagues. And this generation values experiences over things. This is a comment made by the chief marketing officer of the National Football League, which is in the United States by far the biggest sports property and a property that has great heritage and tradition. But he notes that if you don't acquire a fan by the time they're 18, you're most likely never going to get them. In my view, that is sage advice, and it is the primary reason why in the United States, the National Football League continues to dominate from a business perspective and in terms of capturing the mind share of the widest and broadest audience in the States. So my view is that it's critically important that we give voice to the next generation of fans. We have to really, really be plugged in to their behaviors, to their preferences, to their desires. We have to listen and we have to act. And frankly, we have to ignore the naysayers who want to preserve the status quo. And in my experience working with many clients over many years now in Europe, that's the battle I have to enter into most often, is convincing those naysayers and a lot of the people who are at the top of these organizations that they better pay attention to the next generation of fans. And what that means is really a fusion of sports, culture, lifestyle, and purpose that is manifested through more and more through storytelling and the drama around games and bringing to life the athletes that play sports. So people more and more, the next generation, are interested in far more than what happens on the pitch or on the court, and they want to understand and relate to the lifestyles of those athletes. It's interesting to me that we have encouraged clients who have football clubs to host live music. And as you probably understand, there is great resistance because of preservation of the, trying to have the perfect pitch, the grass, preservation of the grass. Whereas Fenway Park, which is perhaps the most storied and most important outdoor baseball stadium in the world in Boston, it's historical, the grass is perfect, and in baseball, just like in soccer, the quality of the grass is really important to the game. Nevertheless, this summer, when the Boston Red Sox are out on the road playing games, they're going to be hosting concerts. Lady Gaga, Aerosmith, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Def Leppard, Zac Brown, Bad Bunny, and Paul McCartney all are booked at Fenway Park during the summer months when the team is on the road. When the team returns, they do their best to bring the grass back to life, but they're prepared and understand that it may not be 100% perfect. It may only be 90% perfect, and they're willing to live with that because they understand that bringing younger generations into that ballpark allows them to share the stories and the traditions of the Boston Red Sox. So we think that's a really interesting example. Oops, sorry. So we must also, of course, leverage tech to provide the content that people want. And what's really important about that, at the time and place they want to receive it. More and more what we're seeing in the States is when a property like the NBA, for example, enters into a domestic national broadcasting agreement with Disney and Turner Broadcasting, that the exclusivity provided around the games only applies to the broadcasting of those games through traditional broadcast, and actually segregates or carves out numerous other rights which allow US teams to show games on multiple platforms. There's many, many examples now where the same game is being shown in more than one place, but presented in a different way. One production might be targeted to people who are betting on games so that the graphics, the content, and the commentary relates to people who may have wagers on the games. Whereas, and I'll show you an example as we come up, another feed may be on Twitch, where the commentators are very different. And what's become really famous, a great example this year, is two of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, Eli and Peyton Manning, who are brothers, by the way, but played on different teams, they're now retired. There's a secondary production where they are the commentators and they're basically sitting in their living room and you're able to listen in on their banter back and forth, and it's attracted a lot of attention. Or last year, the NFL showed several games, not only on traditional networks, but also on Nickelodeon, which is a kids network. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Oops. So why should we care? Well, by the way, here's the Nickelodeon example, which I just love. So as you can see, what they've done is they've taken the game, but they've inserted graphics and commentary that are aimed at young children, making the whole presentation super exciting for those young children. This attracted a great deal of attention in the United States, and most importantly, added 2 million unique viewers to the game. So in addition to very large ratings on traditional channels, they brought to life the game for 2 million kids who watched the game and related to the game in a very different way. So why should we care about all this? I'm just going to bring to life 2 statistics. This is a study that was done 3 years ago by the European Clubs Association. You all are probably familiar with the ECA. And as you can see on the 3rd bar, there is a huge drop-off of interest amongst young adults between 16 and 24 years old. This is really, really, to me, this is kind of jarring. I mean, only 12% are huge fans. So look at what happens from when they're under the control of their parents, 13 to 15, to as they become moving towards adulthood. Their interest in football drops off significantly, whereas having no interest in football increases significantly. To me, when I see this, it tells me that we have a Gen Z problem that we have to address, and we have to address it with some urgency. And then you can see this from a source called, this has been done by a well-known business school in the States, Fanalytics they call it, and you can see what happens, the difference between even millennials and Gen Z in terms of the avidity of their interest, or in the opposite way, being against sports, anti-sports fans, people that have zero interest, increases dramatically amongst Gen Z, and people who are avid sports fans decreases dramatically amongst Gen Z. From my point of view, we can do a lot of analytics, but these 2 statistics speak for themselves and place great urgency on the need to address what I consider to be the Gen Z problem. If sports fandom, this is a quote from the person who did the last statistics, the last study I showed you. If sports fandom is formed by early experiences, these results suggest that fandom will crater in the decades ahead. I mean, that's pretty strong language from somebody who's a university professor like you, doctor, and who studies this really, really carefully. So what is the opportunity ahead? 1, having an omni-channel strategy, which means distributing and curating content, both live game coverage and other kinds of content around the athletes and around the teams and around the brands across multiple platforms. The meaning of that is that we have to go to the platform that are followed by young adults, whether that means TikTok or Twitch or Instagram or Facebook or wherever it may be and wherever it will be in the future. 2, we have to give voice. That means we have to listen, really listen, not just pay lip service to the behaviors and the preferences of Gen Z. Number 3, we have to recognize that some of the changes that we have to adapt are uncomfortable. And this is why there are naysayers. This is why there tends to be resistance, because the reality is most of the sports properties, frankly, particularly in Europe, the governance, and at the top of the governance, it's older white males. And older white males aren't, like me, are not always the best people to be deciding the future of how we present our properties and the content around our properties for the next generation of fans. So we need to see, and we have a huge movement in the United States. You're seeing the front offices of our clubs and our leagues and all of the other properties and agencies that work around the ecosystem of sports. You're seeing those front offices making aggressive moves towards diversity so that decision-making is made by empowered people who reflect society, not just reflect the traditional governance of these properties. We need to blur the lines between reality, meaning physical reality, and digital. So we cannot reject the metaverse and all that goes around, and all the latest buzzwords around NFTs and everything else. We have to embrace it. We have to populate our organizations with people who have the mindset and skills to innovate and the courage to disrupt. So the old line, you asked me earlier, what is the difference between Europe and the US? One of the key differences is that most of the institutions in Europe tend to be governed by, very strong people at the top of a very pyramidal kind of structure. Whereas in the United States, what we're seeing is a flatter organizational structure where people are empowered to make decisions. They're also empowered to make mistakes and to experiment and see what can work and what does not work. And finally, alignment on pitch and off pitch is critically important, which really means breaking down the Berlin Wall between business and sports and recognizing that it's in our mutual interest to do so. So just to kind of close this part, I wanted to share just a few kind of images. It'll be interesting to know if your audience today knows who this person is. His name is Ninja. It's the online alias of Richard Blevins, who's 30 years old. He has 17 million Twitch followers, almost 24 million YouTube subscribers. He's a professional gamer who's very well known in gaming communities, but he's transformed all of that. He's also an author, a musician, a reality show actor, and he has 30 million already in his pocket. But it's the bottom that I want to point to. He became a partner with the National Football League and is co-streaming games on Twitch. And that goes back to the comment I made earlier about meeting fans where they are instead of trying to convince young adults to come to you where you want them. We have to take our content to where they are. This is another example, Major League Baseball, called the Creator Class. 11 Major League Baseball brand ambassadors. These are all social media gurus who have been hand-selected across the entire United States, who are developing content, highlighting players via music, fashion, and art. These people are known as TikTok artists, and the NFL has partnered with them. Why? Because MLB officials have acknowledged that they may have to actually change the game they may have to actually change the game if they're going to appeal to a younger audience that is used to faster moving entertainment. That means that in baseball, which is the most traditional sport we have in the United States, the most tied to its history, to its heritage, the sport that is harder to change than any other sport, because it's the longest sport, it's the most traditional sport in America. Yet they are literally changing the rules of the game in order to appeal to the next generation of fans. And as you can imagine, in European football, that's a very difficult conversation to have. But with my clients, I'm having it all the time. And then there's the NBA, which is really relatable for this next generation of fans. And of course, they launched the NBA 2K League several years ago. Virtually every NBA team now has a 2K League team. But what I like about it is that they've adapted some of the best ideas from the actual NBA and rolled it over into the 2K League, including a draft. That means that the gamers are being repositioned to some extent as athletes. And this has legitimized and created buzz around the 2K League. Here's another example that I like a lot. This is the Fazo clan. I'm not a gamer, but if you're a gamer, you know who this is, and you know what the Fazo clan, because it's the most popular sports entertainment organization, perhaps, and I meant to say esports entertainment organization in the world. There are 510 million hyper engaged fans of the Fazo clan, and they're famous across multiple social platforms. So guess what? The NFL partnered with them to design merchandise, and the sales were through the roof. And here's Ninja again, who I showed you earlier. But now Ninja is appearing in advertisements with NFL legends, old guys and Ninja together, that were run during the Super Bowl, where and Ninja, when he does game commentary on Twitch, is actually challenging the norms of the game. He's been given unprecedented access, and he's speaking his truth. And the NFL is not censoring what he has to say. It's gone over really, really well. Here's a specific example you can see down in the lower left-hand corner. This is an NBA game broadcast on a traditional channel, but also co-broadcasted on Twitch. And you can see that the commentator is overlaid on the screen. So this is not your traditional commentator. This is a commentator who looks, talks, and walks Gen Z. The National Hockey League has established power players. This is a youth advisory board of young adults between 13 and 17 years old. They have a forum on a regular and ongoing basis where the league receives honest and impartial advice, and that's led to massive word of mouth. They have an annual application process to be one of these people that generates tens of thousands of applications annually. Here's another example, and this is from FIFA in Europe, which I really like. They have launched the fan experience panel, where they're focusing on the experience. That's great. This is a group of people that are represented across 6 continents, 17 countries. The only thing I don't like about this, frankly, is these people were selected amongst people who are already avid football fans. So these people were hardcore football fans to begin with, and that's great. But what I'm trying to get across is the idea that we've got to listen to people who are not avid football fans, going back to the early statistics that I showed you. And the last example is my good old friends at EuroLeague basketball. And I was really, really pleased this year that they launched what they're calling the FanZ Lab. And this is, again, this is something that I had proposed to them several years ago, and it's now come to life. I really like it because basketball is a sport that is more flexible, it's more youth-oriented, it has less of a fixation on history and a greater willingness to change. So that's kind of the end of my comments, other than to say status quo is not an option. So, and I'm happy to hear your questions and have a discussion.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Let me ask you something, from my experience with the Olympic Games and following IOC's kind of developments, especially regarding this. Don't you think that this is, the IOC is in the right path towards that direction? Since, for example, in the Tokyo 2020 Games, we had 5 more sports that, they are really directed towards Generation Z.
I think the answer to the question, and I'm not an Olympics expert, but I think the answer to the question is yes and no. The yes is exactly what you said, Doctor, which is 5 more sports, clearly Gen Z oriented sports, Shaun White and other great trick skiing athletes and boarders and all that have been fantastic, and it's been a boon. At least here in the States, the problem is it's really hard to find. I mean, the distribution through is all through traditional networks. They're still selling exclusivity in the States into NBC and their multiple networks. And I got to tell you, because we just had the Winter Olympics, and it's really hard to find what's happening, when it's happening, where it's happening. In other words, if you go to my earlier comment, they're not distributing those sports to the places where the people are. They're asking those people to come to their platforms. And that, in my opinion, is ultimately a mistake. You couldn't find any Olympic coverage on Twitch at all, or places like Twitch. So I had to go to various NBC networks, and the scheduling of it and how it was presented, very, very difficult. So I can tell you, at least in the States, I don't know about in Greece or the rest of Europe, television ratings for the Winter Olympics this year were significantly declined. So that's a yes and no answer.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a few questions from our audience. The first one is, what is the biggest factor for the decrease in interest in sport for young adults?
Well, I think number one, as I made reference to before, is the fact that young adults are digital natives. The idea that they really grew up with a phone in their pocket. I know as a parent now of a 21-year-old son, when he was young, he was born in the year 2000, so he is exactly Gen Z. We were trying to be good parents and keep the phone out of his hands as long as we could, but ultimately society takes over. So ultimately there was a phone in his hand, by the time he was sort of 12 or 13, which is, we're seeing this all over the world, and that age is getting younger and younger. And once you put that smartphone in their hand, they have the whole world in their pocket. They have access to content and material. They grow up with that phone. So I think sort of distraction is a big, big factor. And then the other one is fragmentation. We're in an era of streaming. We're in an era of so many different social platforms, so many different sources of content, so many different channels of content, that now you have fragmentation. And so with fragmentation, it means that you don't have big mass audiences gathering around, sitting in the same space, watching the same game as a family, or a group of friends together. So I think those are the biggest factors. It's a, you know, for young adults, you know, it's no longer, you know, we live in a global world. They have access to everything. And I think that's, you know, sort of the bottom line. There's all kinds of research, you probably know it better than I do, Doctor, around the fact that Gen Z has grown up with different sensitivities, less interested in material possessions, more interested in experiences, always interested in purpose, which is a good thing. The fact that you're seeing so many sports properties getting behind cause marketing and focusing on the idea of purpose, beginning to take a stance behind environmental stewardship, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and topics like that. It's a different mentality that Gen Z has, and we who are not Gen Z have to adapt to that mentality if we're going to continue to have viable businesses.
I guess you answered the second question, but I'm gonna give it to you just in case. Apart from utilizing social media, how can sports approach the younger generation? And I think your answer, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have to understand them first.
We have to understand them first, and then we have to use a lot of imagination. You know, it's social media is terrific, but it's not only about social media. There tends to be this idea that I've seen with some of my clients, frankly, that, you know, if we just pour content into all these various platforms, that it'll all take care of itself, and that's not correct. The quality of the content is extremely important, and that content has to be precisely curated for the audience at hand. And to get great content means that we have to have better access. We cannot have a situation, and you see this is another big difference between Europe and the States. I mean, I watched an NBA game the other night where during the entire first half of the game, a player who was in the game had a microphone. Now, they did not share the audio from that microphone live, but they did share it over the course of the broadcast. You know, that they taped it, and so that they gave us some insights into some of the banter going on the court. If I suggested something like that to a European football team, they would put me on a plane and send me back to the United States. I mean, the difference of access to these athletes in the United States and Europe is really significant. In Europe, the players have kind of a wall around them. One of the great things that's been done in the States in several stadiums now, particularly, by the way, soccer stadiums, is when the players come out of the locker room to go out onto the pitch, they walk through a club area, which is a privilege for certain people to be able to sort of high five the players and for their kids to be next to the players as they're walking through. In Europe, I suggested that to several different clients, and many of those clients liked that idea. And they actually implemented the idea with one exception. They put a big glass wall, floor to ceiling glass wall, between the players on one side and the fans on the other side. So you actually can't hear the player. Those walls need to come down. Those walls are barriers. You know, we're a little too, in Europe, I think, a little too protective of the game. That's not to say I'm disrespecting the game, but we're a little too protective of the game, the pitch, the traditions, and the history. We have to recognize that these players are young adults. These players are exactly the target audience that we want to reach. So we have to let the players' personalities and lives be shared to some extent with the audiences of the future.
Well, I'm a football fan myself since I was young, and it took us a long time in Europe to take down the fences because of hooliganism and the different approach we have to being a fan, especially a football fan in Europe, and being a sports fan in the United States. So now we have to take down the glass wall probably, this different approach of the fans towards a very popular sport like European football is what makes the difference. I don't know if you have followed, the history of football in Europe.
Oh, I've followed it, maybe not as closely as you have, but I followed it pretty good. I mean, I had the French Football League was a client for several years, and I spent a great deal of time in Marseille, and I remember walking into that stadium for the first time, and the fans were basically inside of a cage. I mean, I couldn't believe it. There were these huge chain link fences around the fans. I mean, I've never seen anything like that in my life. And it was, when I came into the building, in fact, there were police on horses with riot shields, with AK-47s around their shoulders. And, I understand that's where, this whole hooliganism thing, I get it. But to me, there has to be a dramatic shift in the mentality of accepting that. We have to stop accepting that that's who the fans are. The reality is that's really a small percentage of the fans. I think those kinds of people should not, people that want to come to games to be violent and destructive and abusive should simply not be allowed to come to games on some level. And I know it's difficult and complicated, but every time we have this discussion in Europe, what finally happens is the president of the team is too afraid to lose their supporters, when the truth of the matter is the vast majority of supporters aren't like that. And by the way, if we allow that kind of atmosphere to continue in our stadiums, the fact is that we are also pushing away these very young adults that we need to appeal to. They're not interested in that generally. We're pushing away families. We're pushing away women. I mean, here in the States, the National Football League, 49% of the attendees at the game and something like 48% of the viewers through the various audiovisual channels are women. And, we have to get a lot more diverse, and we have to appeal to more diverse audiences. And if that means that we have to sort of sacrifice this notion of these supporters who, and I know, by the way, I've been to Greece many times. I've been to a lot of basketball games. I know what happens at Panathinaikos and Olympiakos, okay? So I get it. In my opinion, that has to change, or we're going to be in trouble.
Okay, we have one last question. We have Generation Z as the target audience and Generation X as decision makers in sport organizations. There is definitely a need for millennials to take a step forward to fill the gap. How accepting are sport businesses to this challenge?
Not. that's the short answer. And so it's there. There is resistance by the people at the top of the governance pyramids, no question about it. Now, I'm not saying across the board. My client, La Liga, which is led by a president that is pretty well known named Javier Tebas, I think has done an outstanding job embracing the need for change on some level. There's some places he won't go. I get it. He's in a tough position, but they just La Liga just announced new music initiatives, and they're beginning to do things that make sense. But I think we have to, those of you who are millennials, and even on the kind of the older side of Gen Z who are beginning to have jobs and play management roles in these organizations, have to speak up and have to really demand empowerment. I know it's difficult. I'm hoping that forums like this, where people like me will speak up, will sort of encourage and hopefully inspire other people to speak up. But this is exactly, the question was perfect. You have Gen X decision makers making decisions that are going to affect the Gen Z target audience. Those two things are not aligned. And we have to change that. And we have to demand diversity in the decision-making process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glickman. Nice to meet you. although
nice to
it
meet
was
you,
by
Doctor.
chance. We were not supposed to meet. And would love to, to see you again in one of the other. I'm sorry? We have one more question. Okay. One more question. We want to keep you here, you see, huh?
No problem. My pleasure.
Do you believe that the rules of every sport must change to adapt to the habits of Generation Z? For example, the duration of the game.
Well, the good news about soccer, which is the dominant sport, of course, in Europe, is the game's pretty fast, at least from my perspective. The games move along because you don't have timeouts. So now there's these sort of long dry spells, which, is hard for an American to understand, where the clock keeps going and then they add extra time. But soccer games actually happen, fairly quickly. For the people who are selling food and beverage, they don't really like that in the States, right? Because, they want to have timeouts so people can go out and get a beer. I think the answer to that is yes. I think we have to look carefully, but there's a lot. Listen, content isn't just a matter of the live game. There's other forms of content that will reach these audiences. So yes, we have to tweak the rules. Major League Baseball, as I made reference to, is doing that. But for example, with the NBA, if you're a subscriber to the NBA, I think it's the, what do they call it? The outer market. They have an outer market package so you can get NBA games from other markets. They give you the option of watching the whole game or a condensed version of the game. Because the truth is, my son, who's 21, who's a huge NBA fan, the way he watches NBA games is by going to social media platforms and looking at highlights. It is very rare that he sits and watches a game from beginning to end. He just wants to see the great moments. The key is, though, that he can see those great moments within literally seconds after it actually happened. Whereas in Europe, the broadcast agreements don't allow you to do that. Here, the NBA and the leagues here have insisted and have been successful in negotiating agreements where they can sell highlights, but within seconds of the live occurrence, to other platforms. So if you're in TikTok, you can see NBA game highlights within seconds of when it really happened.
So I guess with a last question we have, you don't see any future in certain sports if, this lack of interest doesn't lead people to change certain things.
Well, it's not that I don't see a future. That's a little more pessimistic probably than is reality. I understand there's big audiences and great heritage around our sports. But if status quo remains, what I do see is a slow decline of interest. And by the way, I see basketball potentially coming up, because basketball, as I made reference, is more adaptable and more flexible. And there's other sports behind it. But yes, I think it's a really urgent problem. And I think we are going to see declines of interest. And I think if, we want sustainable and economically viable sports properties, that we have to adapt. I mean, look what happened during the last 2.5 years of COVID and how it's been a disaster for European football. I don't think we know today just how significant the economic impact of COVID is going to be. And I'm hoping that COVID, it was an unwelcome situation, but is a wake-up call to the properties that they're going to have to adapt, because, you can't continue to borrow money to pay off borrowed money. I mean, at some point, that's going to catch up with you.
Thank you very much. We hope that was an interesting and different beginning of your day, and we would love to see you back in our event.
I really enjoyed myself. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.